Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Vidas Enlighten. Today, I would like to introduce.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Jasmine, de nuevo, for this opportunity and this space. My name is Petrona Dominguez. I use she, her, ella pronouns, and I am a first-generation college student and DACA recipient.
Thank you. And then, y'all know me, Jasmine, is she, her, hers. And before we get started, would you like to say a fun fact about yourself?
Yes. Fun fact about myself is I used to play the drums when I was younger. I used to actually be part of you could say a band. It was more of like a little choir for church, but we would play like cumbias and zapateados, with church songs,
Mm-hmm.
So that was something that I really enjoyed back then. And I don't know how to play. Well, I probably do. I just haven't practiced. But I do miss those times where I would just like stress out, drum it out, and all of that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Being a fun fact, alongside instruments, I can play the triangle because you just have to tap the triangle. So yeah, fun fact, I can play the triangle. And then go ahead and share a quote that you enjoy or you resonate with, and then explain why you enjoy that quote.
Yeah. So one of the quotes that I really wanted to highlight, and I'll say the background here really quickly about why I really enjoy this quote. And it comes from Rigoberta Menchú. She is a indigenous activist, indigenous advocate who back in the 60s was doing a lot of like civil rights movement in Guatemala. And of course, during that time, estaba la guerrilla, and whoever was running the presidency at the time obviously was not in the same mentality as her and did not like her views, and therefore she became a target. And since, I can't recall the date, but since then she has not been able to go back to Guatemala. So she'll probably do a lot of traveling within Mexico and just kind of around Latin America. And I really appreciate her because, growing up here in Forest Grove, it was very rarely that I ever got to hear, of an actual indigenous individual who was still living, who's from Central America, who's from Guatemala, which is where my family is from and where I'm from, who is highlighted, right? And she has books. She's an author. She's a poet, and I mean, she has a lot of knowledge. And I feel like she becomes shadowed with the mainstream media and who we continue to see as leaders in the community. And as much as I have respect for Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, we often forget to think about our Native American communities and our indigenous communities. So one of the quotes that she highlighted was this one about, and it goes like this: peace cannot exist without justice. Justice cannot exist without fairness. Fairness cannot exist without development. Development cannot exist without democracy. Democracy cannot exist without respect for the identity and worth of cultures and people. And this quote really just highlights, right, a quote that, she said back in the 60s to today, which we're in 2020 and not that far along, since that happened. But, it seems like we're still in that same era. It's just transformed into this new thing. And so it really is relevant to what we're experiencing in today's world. And more so, just her words of wisdom and, just her words of encouragement really show out from this quote and what it is to be a new version in a new world where we can really take in these words and words of other leaders who, have that same mentality to make change, right? The change that we have been seeking as communities of colors and as a community in general. So I really admire Rigoberta Menchú.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that quote. The quote I would like to share on this podcast would be, never forget where you came from and who helped you get there. And I think I relate that to who helped me get to higher ed. So I think like my preschool programs up to elementary school, middle school, high school, I always had the accessibility to mentors, teachers, and I don't take that for granted. I think I'm very appreciative that I have had access to mentors and yeah, I think I'm a strong advocate of that education should be accessible for various communities, and so I really enjoy that quote. Yeah, and so we're going to talk about this podcast about experiences shaping our complex identities, immigration, education, career, and BML intersectionality. And we're just going to dive into conversations. And then feel free to go ahead and start the convo.
Yeah. So first and foremost, muchas gracias, Ray, for creating this platform, this space, as a life learning experience for you. But also, for someone who needs kind of that therapeutic moment to express themselves, express the issues that are going on, and just, looking at the complexity of the world and how we are all, in some sort of way having some sort of traumatic experience, whether, we're dealing with COVID-19, whether it's, you as an individual who is affected deeply by the systemic oppression and the systemic racism that we have here in the US, and more so, right, with the Black Lives Matter movement. And, today, I did not envision that we would have this conversation just yet. But, today we had the decision on DACA, and that was a huge life changer for so many people, and for myself. And of course, it comes to show that we as individuals, we as a community, we as people have el poder, we have the power to make change and transform the society that we really want, and not have to rely, so to say, on this idea of a government that's going to sustain us, because we as a community can do that to each other. That's how we continue to uplift one another. That is how we become resilient, and that is how we use these experiences in these moments that, feel like, it's the end of the world, to really make that specific change. Um, so I think first and foremost, I wanted to talk a lot about this intersectionality between, our experiences in regards to how that has, to some extent, made our biased decisions, our opinions, and how we use our opinions and our experiences to be a participating members of some sort of movement. I know for me, I reflect a lot on my experiences and my upbringings. That when I was younger, I, of course, don't have a lot of family member to look up to. Education was a huge thing for my parents, because that's why I was brought here in the US, right? To seek a better dream, to seek a place where I can call home. And when I learned about my status in the US, when I was around high school age, I was in complete shock, and I could not believe that, you know, this was my new reality. And I'm really just very appreciative of the fact that the experiences that I've had have really made an impact on how I view myself and how I see myself in the future. And something that I've also mentioned is, coming here to Forest Grove, uh, living here was a very white school, and I had to quickly assimilate to this new world and this new culture, this new language. At the time, I spoke my indigenous language, and I spoke um, very little Spanish, but I had to learn right there and then to learn English, and my parents pressured me to learn English because I was going to start school, and I had less than 6 months really to learn English and get the basic, you know, grasp of how to communicate with someone. And that, you know, at the time, I had to do it. But when I reflect upon it now, it really is just disappointing that I had to go through that. And for anyone really who has to encounter those moments and are basically forced, right? Because at the time we had no understanding, no cultural competency of people to acknowledge that it's important to, take in people who are from other backgrounds and accept them and make the change that needed to be. And now I speak better English than I do my indigenous language because I completely forgot my indigenous language. And that experience really showed me that we as people, right, as individuals, are not shaped necessarily by those experiences, but it's just how we use that experience to our advantage. There was a time where I felt like that experience completely just ruined my life. I felt very disconnected, having to face the complexity of who am I, what are my identities, not fitting in with white peers, not fitting in with mostly majority white or Mexican friends, and just going back and forth, not having people to really look up to who are from Central America and in general Oregon, not having a lot of Central Americans here. I felt very left out, very alone. And I'm very glad that I was able to participate in various programs. I've been very involved in a lot of things, and that's just kind of how my personality has been. I like to really be I'm very curious. So when I have a curiosity, I of course want to go and see what that is, and I want to be a part of this, and I want to just be out there. And I'm glad that my parents taught me that because it really helped me along the way in the future. And had it not been for those type of experiences, had it not been for me being out there and about, I think that I would be a completely different person than I am right now. And same thing with my status upbringing. Like when I found out about that, I had no idea who to talk to. My parents didn't really want to talk about it. They didn't really explicitly say that I was undocumented. It's just they said that I couldn't travel to certain places for a certain reason. And that was a very difficult time because I had no one else to look up to. I had no one else to talk to about it. And rather than using that moment to push me down, right, or get into this very deep hole, I decided to use that experience when I entered PCC to get involved and to start learning more. And so I got actively involved in PCC and community college, and I was able to participate in this program called the Oregon Leadership Institute program. And it was a really great class, a really great year because I connected with other folks who were in that same position as me. I learned about, right, like the idea of identity and how we ourselves have that power to make ourselves be known. And had it not been for that class, I think I wouldn't be as involved as I have been in the past and what I have been able to do now. And so, a lot of those ideas really became also because I was intersecting and I was connecting with people from different backgrounds, different cultures, different immigration statuses, but we have that same commonality of being undocumented, and that intersecting moments really shined light to the reality of this world. It really opened my eyes and my perspective to being open and empathetic with people, and having the willingness to at least listen to understand and listen to learn, and become knowledgeable, become educated. You don't necessarily have to go to school to get those basic learning skill sets, or to understand a certain person's perspective, just because we have so many tools nowadays. We have books, we have Google, we have the internet,
YouTube,
and
podcasts,
yeah, podcast, there you go.
yeah.
So we have the resources. It's just the willingness of us as individuals to actually do the work. And I'm very fortunate, and it's a very big privilege to be able to go to school, and I acknowledge that. But I really know that my experiences have been on the ground. The things that I have learned, yes, maybe it came from a certain class, but it really was because I was connecting with other people and I was pushing myself to connect with them. And I have a lot of learning to do still. I'm not the worldwide genius book that can say everything. I have so much to learn from people and so many people to meet still and understand their perspectives. But I think having the heart and willingness to understand and listen to them and just, you know, take a stand back and just hear out what's going on. And I'm really grateful for those experiences because that has really shaped me who I am. You know, the things that I've had to go through, my obstacles in life and my experiences, give me a perspective of how I would want someone else to think of me when I'm, you know, talking to them. And so I really use that and make sure that I have that type of mentality when I'm speaking to someone else. And so, you know, it just kind of dives right back into this idea of like how we use our experiences and our identities and how can we connect them to similar struggles that we are seeing and experiencing today. We have, of course, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement that has really risen up recently these past couple of days because of the killing and murdering and injustice towards the Black community. And, you know, for some reason, and I'm not sure how, why, you know, we separate immigration from Black folks, like as if they didn't experience this. You know, we've seen how anti-Blackness has run into a lot of like Latin American or Latinx or Hispanics, whatever you want to call it, communities. And realistically, we have a lot of, you know, African Indigenous, Black Indigenous, you know, Black community members who are undocumented and who also say, you know, have that similar struggle. Um, so I guess for me, really, it's how to use those experiences and connect it and be of support and ally as I would expect it to be in the same struggles that I have um, when we think about immigration and anything that relates to immigration topics and the movements that come with it. And also learning from one another, because if anything that we have learned in the past, it is that when, you know, people of color come together and unite as one, we can make a huge change. And, you know, I think that's what we saw in a lot of past movements, whether you want to talk about the Chicano movement, the upbringing of feminism and including people of color, people, you know, women of color. If you want to talk about the Black Panther movement, right, and the civil rights movement, there has always been a unity, and it may have not been as strong as it should have been, but there has always been some sort of unity that has really shined light to it. And of course, the folks who are deeply invested and affected are the ones who are taking charge, right? Because that is the intention, right? For folks who are affected and who are experiencing that to be in the forefront. And we as allies, we stand back. So very important to acknowledge, right, what does privilege look like for each and every one of us? Because we all have privileges, we all hold privileges, some more than others, but it's how we use those privileges and those moments and to our advantage to support a community that we know is also hurting. And I think lastly that I would say kind of with that is just this idea, right, of understanding all these systemic issues that we have encountered is very historical. And I am not a person who can, so to say, you know, has a background in history and therefore I shouldn't be validated for my experiences or validating for what I do say. But, you know, what I have learned, right, from other people who use their degree for this specific teaching and researching is that, you know, Black liberation is liberation for all these systemic issues that we are seeing. Because if we can finally take a moment to address and fix this broken systemic issue that we have and the racism that has upheld towards Black folks, then every other community that has been marginalized can find a solution towards their own problems as well. But it has to come from understanding that we need to address the Black liberation and the Black community and making sure that we put them at the forefront because they have been the ones, even prior to colonization, who have been enslaved, who have been killed, who have been murdered, who have been seen as an object and as money, as a token, and used, right, for the advantage of wealth and power and good. And it's just, we really need to understand that as a community in order to really get to that point of, saying, you know what, we're finally there. We've reached justice. And what does justice look like? It's, using and the experiences of people of color people who are affected, but making sure that we are making those spaces.
Thank you for sharing that. I think you definitely touched upon a good like keynote example you're talking about. Understanding privileges, and very important just to create these conversations, create spaces where people can talk about real life social justice issues, or any terms that are I myself don't identify as a DACA recipient, to help me understand like my own privileges, even as a POC student in higher ed. And yeah, I think with the like what's going on with DACA currently, I think it's important that these students and various throughout the nation are continuing to fight for their rights. I think education is a human right, and I think people, no matter your identity, should have access to education, not just here in the United States, but like in third world countries as well. But my question is, how do you find your passion, or do you have any advice for someone that wants to find their passion?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is going to come down from taking a moment, right, to step back, and what are some of the barriers and the struggles that you have encountered, right? Where are your privileges? And I think mapping that out, and when I say mapping out, I'm physically saying like you actually take a piece of paper or something to write with space, where you can put down, okay, under this category, these are some of the struggles that I have encountered. In this category, these are some of the privileges I hold. If you don't know what privileges there are outside of just your color and your immigration status, look up, what are some privileges that we have as individuals. And oftentimes one of the biggest ones that we forget is, thinking if we fit into the gender that we were assigned, that is a privilege. If we fit into being people who can walk freely, who have, no, not necessarily no mental, where we have to access more, accessibility or resources to function, that is a privilege. And there's so many privileges that we see and we are learning every day, and that's the reality of social justice work, right? Is recognizing that social justice brings and highlights systemic issues, and it also inspires to fix that systemic issue or that issue itself, that social issue, to be able to have this group of people who are experiencing this barrier, to be able to move freely into the world as well, as we all should, right? We all talk about liberation and freedom, and everyone should have that, but unfortunately we're not there. And then I would also suggest, right, like as you're mapping out those two categories, start thinking of what are some commonalities that you have with other movements, right? Like what are some other movements that you have heard about? Or if you don't know, right, start looking up movements that have happened in the past and that are happening right now. And what are some of those uprising movements? Why are they mad? Why are they, question? And I really love sociology courses, studying of social problems or social issues, whether it's macro level or micro level. And I wish this is something that they would teach us in our K through 12 education, but it's to question everything that is around you, because when you start to question things and when you start to see the world in a new perspective and a new lens, which really, that's a lot of the social justice lens, that to realize, right, those systemic problems that are happening. And I feel like that really also helps continue folks to think about where they fit into the realm. And from there, right, as you were kind of comparing and contrasting and looking at similarities and what are the privileges that you hold, I feel like that's really going to help an individual figure out, okay, I need to learn more about this. I've never learned about this, or I've never heard about this, as you're doing your own research. You need to investigate more. Be open, right? And be honest and transparent to talk with people that you need more learning from. And know that you do have to take your time to do some of the research before you go out and start talking to people, because it is a very traumatic experience for a lot of folks. And I can say this only for myself, that as someone who has had to kind of, you know, encounter this world and perspective of what it means to be undocumented, um, after a while, sharing my story just became very heavy for me and very traumatic, because I've shared it so many times, and maybe I'm touching someone's heart, maybe I'm not, but having to constantly repeat it and feel like that I need that pity, like it's very frustrating, and it's very like heartbreaking that we have to say sad stories for people, you know, in order for people to understand us. And it should not really come to that point. I think we should be able to have some sort of experience, or not necessarily experience, but have some sort of empathy for individuals, and just hear them out. And I think as a human, our body tells us, our body literally guides us in those moments when we're being vulnerable, when you're seeing vulnerability. And if someone is willing and able to do that with you, that is a gift. That is a very powerful moment, because then you start to see a person as a human rather than these issues, rather than this category, rather than this role, rather than the stereotype. So I think, you know, when you can come down to that category and make that mapping, that little map for yourself, I feel like that is when you're going to be able to find your passion and fire. And I know for me, you know, protesting is not for everyone, or being actively engaged in some sort of way is not for everyone. But for me, that was where I really found my passion. And it really took a lot of, for me to be able to open up to individuals about it too. And I feel like that's for me what really caught my attention and my fire. And ever since then, when I think about what's going on, right, with Black folks, Black brothers and sisters who are dying at the forefront of the hands of police brutality, you know, I can't feel their pain, and I can't ever understand that pain, because I don't have to experience that as an individual who can still, you know, just be a brown individual. But I can sympathize to some extent, right? Are in detention centers, who are being caged up, who are being killed because of ICE, right? And so there, for me, it's like I I I have to understand that, and I have to use that same voice, that same passion, that same fire to be in solidarity with this community and listen to them. And I really hope that, you know, like, I think for me, that's how I've come into this world and into this fight. And I think that's how a lot of other people have also done too, because there's some sort of commonality. And it goes back to this idea, right, of intersectionality, intersecting various movements, and to be able to be in solidarity with one another and create change because of that. Because at the end of the day, right, we all bleed the same blood. No one's bleeding out green or orange. It's, you know, the same blood that we have, that multicolored DNA, that, you know, even though we might have small little strands of different blood, we are all one human race. We are one human body, one human community. I would hope, right, that people can see that as they're kind of experiencing their own research and their own pathway to understanding. But then, of course, there's other folks who will not. And one of the things that one of my mentors mentioned to me a while back was this idea, right, about when to consider somebody ignorant and not. And for me, the experience that I have had is that I have always experienced that, you know, when I'm around white folks, I immediately am not comfortable with them, because I have this kind of stereotypical idea of what white folks are. And not to say that, of course, everyone is like that, because I have some amazing white friends and some amazing, like, community leaders who have really been a huge part of my life. But there are times, right, where sometimes I'll be quick to judge, but I have to remember, you know, if this individual has grown up a certain way, right, their parents or the people that they were with brought them into this space, in a certain mentality, thought, and kept them restricted from being able to connect. Be someone to blame them for their upbringing, just as somebody would think of me as, oh, it's your parents' fault for bringing you here, or your family member for bringing you here. No, right? Um, I have to think that if I can give them the knowledge, if I can give them the tools, if I can willing to give a piece of my time, right, to make them understand that my story and maybe stories of other people, uh, and they still choose to not want to maybe be open about it, or they still choose to be in that same mentality and just disregard everything, then yes, I think that's when you call somebody an ignorant. And expose them. I'm all about exposing people because we need to know who's out there, right? And it's not to make people mad or frustrated. I think it's, for me, it's more of like a call to action, like, hey, you know, think about what you're doing because you have other people around you. And sometimes you might not even know that those people around you really care about for you, and your actions are affecting them. And sometimes we all need that kind of awakening and that call out. Um, so I guess that would be my advice to people who are kind of trying to find that passion and fire within them. And uh, more than anything, of course, is knowing that, again, not everything is going to come easy and fast and simple. Not everything is going to be understanding like the first time. It takes some time. But as long as you're willing to be patient with yourself, first and foremost, be patient with other people, and be patient with the change that's going on and be accepting of that. And again, just being very open and empathetic with the experiences of other people. I feel like that will really help someone who is trying to understand their role in their purpose in life, and also understand, right, where their passion is and their fire is, because we all have it in there. It's just about opening it up and teaching ourselves how to do that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Greatly worded. I think um, empathy is really important, especially when you might have uh, people that are into politics and are on both sides of the spectrum. But I think in general, like future generation or this current generation can't hold people accountable, or if there are racist people in power or whatever. That I understand that, like, people holding people accountable. I just saw on social media, I can't remember what town, but that town, like the police officer, sheriffs had their like ID badges covered with tape, and like they're
Mm,
supposed to show their, I saw the woman holding them accountable, like, hey, and I think things like that is very important. Um, to if one finds something like an injustice or people in power, being able to do the right thing. And going into the next question, can this generation continue to normalize new equitable views, or continue to destigmatize topics?
I think there's definitely no right or wrong answer to that. I feel like that's something that we are still, as a society, trying to understand and experience what that even means for us, right, as a human society. I do think though that, right, we as a society have definitely normalized a lot of things because we're comfortable, and we like this idea of comfort. Um, and some of us, right, like the idea of change, and because they see, things that are going on, and maybe things just need a little bit of updating. But I think in this world that we're in right now, I would hope that we can begin to normalize the idea behind feeling uncomfortable, because we have this idea, right, as a society, to be comfortable with what we have now, and that we should keep it like that.
Mm.
And Not to say that everyone is like that, but I think as a society in general, there's this perspective that we need to normalize things.
Yeah, I think I agree. Like with, for example, like mental health and like migrant families or just POC families, how mental health isn't really like a norm to talk about, or maybe I think this generation can continue to make that a normalize that, or machismo,
Mm-hmm.
try to destigmatize that. I think that this generation also, if willing to like also like maybe come up with new social justice terms as well, if um, however that might look like. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
To bring mental health into this because, as you're mentioning, right, we have this idea, the right, that at least in a lot of patriarchal societies or countries that still have this tradition of um, men are more powerful than women, is the idea, right, that they can't show their emotions, or that, as a cultural, specifically, I'm going to speak more about being from Guatemala. But I know there's a lot of similarities between other like Latinx countries where we cultivate this idea that we don't need to express ourselves and that therapy is a very white thing and that's not what we need to do. But realistically, I think we are starting to see the movement for mental health awareness, mental health well-being. What does that look like for our own traditions and cultures? Um, because it is very important, right? Again, going back to like this idea of being okay to start having those very, very deep conversations and dialogues that can be very super rich and powerful to just understand a certain problem or an issue. And kind of tying that back to the mental health awareness is, I feel like nowadays we are able to see more male identified, right? Or male appearing to be able to show off their emotions and be okay with the fact that they can express themselves. And I really appreciate that people are doing that and that there's a huge push for that because it goes back to this idea that we can change and we can unnormalize the normal, if that makes sense. Um, and I think that speaks a lot to other issues that we can talk about and do. And I think about specifically more about education. We have this idea that the more educated you are, educated meaning that you have your bachelor's and your master's, that you are seen in society, right, as more powerful, as someone that's knowledgeable, that has a lot of the right answers. But I know so many people who have not gone to school, but because of their experiences, right, because of the amount of things that they do and that they do on their daily basis and that they do in their community has taught them, if not has achieved better than someone who goes to school. So it's really about how you're going to use your experiences, how are you actually putting it into the real world in perspective, because that is what we live in, that is what we are doing every day. It's not some made up fantasy, and that's why we go to school. You have to really use those experiences, and of course it doesn't apply to every profession, because I probably wouldn't think that you need to have some sort of lived experiences to be, I don't know, let's say a doctor who can do surgery, right? Like, I would see how you need to go to school for that and take specific courses for that. But I think more like if you're doing a lot of social services, and you have a lot of interaction with people, you don't necessarily need a background, right, to talk to somebody, like, or a degree that says you know how to talk to people. It comes from experience. Um, so it's just something that we can start to normalize as well.
yeah, I think I want to talk about intersectionality, the topic of intersectionality again. I think creating community. I learned more about intersectionality in one of the classes um, I was in at my university, and the quote was like, "The oppressor can be oppressed." But I think this quote is important, but it does not erase the bitter truths of history. For example, like racism and um, the
Mm-hmm.
fact that white privilege is a thing, and just how the whole systematic racism or inequalities. Um, and I think the oppressor can be oppressed in the sense where like someone that might identify as white can go to like Hawaii and like be the only white person. But I also do want to emphasize that does not erase the bitter truths of history and how uh, that I think maybe like uh, maybe if this generation can make a turn for the fact that white people can't face racism, maybe like naming a new term. I think the fact that um, history itself, that the uh, minorities, POC, Black community, um, I think that how can we as society further continue that to help make spaces, you know, and like call people out if people are ignorant, or how can we continue to make these conversations and I on social media I saw white children, I had seen children that identify as white that with like the BML movement, that they don't agree with their parents' ideologies, and these same children, I emphasize, they're crying because they're like, oh yeah, I don't agree with my parents. So I think I have empathy there. It's like how are the mental health of these children that might not have support from their family or trying to break those chains of racism in their families, you know? And I think a call to action is how are children learning to um, how are children learning about social justice topics and
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, I think I really like that you bring this idea of call to action because they're so important. Uh, and you don't have to be a certain age to be doing some sort of advocacy work. There is no age limit that says you need to be this age to be an advocate in your community. It starts from as when you're young. I know that one of the things that I have seen, right, especially in like this idea of young folks, and I'm not gonna get super deep into this, but I had a professor who brought this idea behind how we see and envision children, and how we, they gave us a little historical background, right, of why do children go to school from K through 12, why for so long. And it was because back then, and I can't remember recall the dates, but back then before, industrialization and whatnot, children were a part of the labor work. Children were outside working. Of course, again, going back to those gender roles, men were outside, women are inside, and, had different roles, but children were a part of it. And so it was a whole family system that was actually being active and participating in doing their part in their family. However, it seems like, as, more people started to intermix with each other, having more children, more babies, there was just this amount of children that were not doing anything. So they started thinking about, well, how can we start educating, or how can we put these children, right, to do something? And that's where this idea of education, a school system, came into play. And it's really interesting because I didn't know that. And again, it goes back to this idea of questioning things, like how did school get in, like what did this idea of school look like, and why, right? This person brought me to think and reflect on my own school experiences. But when this professor told us about this, he started talking more specifically about children and how we view all these different ages as if they're distinctly different from one another. And I think physically, yes, right? Someone who's older in the sense of like who, probably finished uh, all their health growth areas, whatever you want to call it, versus obviously a baby who was just born. Obviously, there's difference, right? People who are older more than likely probably already taught certain things based on their experiences, and the experiences of those parents that are teaching them, right? But babies come into this new world, and of course, they're going to start learning based on whatever's around their environment. And point being is that there was a picture of a baby in a seat, in their little chair seat with their spoon and their food, and then you have another baby who's similarly around the same age and similarly is capable of doing the same thing, but in this sense, this baby had a machete and a coconut. And of course, everyone was quick to judge. What the heck is this baby doing with a machete and a coconut? This baby doesn't know what they're doing. They're going to cut their hands off. They're going to whatever. Nobody questioned the other baby that had his applesauce with his spoon. And the reflection on that picture was that, afterwards, you see this baby who had just finally cut a coconut and the other baby who had made a huge mess on his chair seat. The reflection and the outcome and the purpose of that picture was to show, right, that children are like sponges. And we've heard this analogy, right, that they've taken all the information that they have and they suck it in, and that's how they learn. And that's how we all learn, I should say. And the idea behind that was that the way we view different ages and how we restrict it is to keep this idea of power, to keep control, because we don't want to deal with the issue. And that's what happened with children and going to school, and the reason why we go to school. And I mean, of course, now probably it's because, we want to educate folks and teach them life learning lessons. But sometimes I feel like in school, we don't even learn the real, actual tools that we need to adjust and move around this world. Sometimes I feel like it's just so repetitive and it's not needed. And some of it, of course, is very institutionalized. So a lot of the history is not real, right? Especially for someone who probably doesn't identify as certain, as a certain character, person, sorry. But it was very interesting. And so kind of going back to this idea of call to action, right? Like, how do we start making changes and using the amount of experiences and knowledge that we have to teach others who probably don't have that opportunity and that space. I think it goes back to that, is how are you going to teach someone what you have learned, what you have experienced, so that they also have the curiosity, or that they have the tools, or that they have some sort of piece of knowledge from what you've understood. I think that's like the biggest call to action that I would say that we need to start doing more as a society. Be able and willing to share, and really use the values of community to, be open and not feel like everything is ours and that we only do things by ourselves. We do it as a community. So I really appreciate that you bring that up, because I think that would be my biggest call to action to anyone. Aside from the idea of trying to find your passion, but that would be the second thing, right? Just share your knowledge.
Yeah, I think a call to action I want to add to real quick was that continuing to advocate for cultural studies, for example, like ethnic studies. Can you I was involved in the school district in high school, and my school district, Millsboro School District, wanted to fund and create ethnic study support. And I think, how does that look like at higher ed, high school, elementary school? Is there ethnic studies representation, etc.? So I think that's a great call to action that I would also like to add to that. Yeah. But yeah, do you have any other topics that you would like to add or mention?
I think we can dive a lot deeper into a lot of these different themes or subjects, as you want to call it, because they're so important. But I think the only other thing that I would really want to finish off with and add is, of course, thanking you for the space, right? And thanking you for creating this out of your heart and being able to just create the platform that is really needed, especially with everything going on. And I would hope and encourage other folks that, and not to say that you should open up a podcast yourself and do it, or a YouTube channel or whatever, but if you can have a dialogue with someone, just do a quick check-in with your close ones that you have at home. Like, how can we start having those very deep conversations and dialogues? Because as we have seen, when we normalize to stay silent, to not have an opinion on an issue, or choose to not want to speak about it, that really hurts the overall outcome or the overall goal of what we are trying to accomplish in this world. And of course, being silent is not going to solve the problems or the issues. It's going to create more, if anything. So it's about how to start being more vocal and sticking to your opinion. And if you feel like you are always being challenged, think about it. Be curious, bring that curiosity of why are you always being challenged. Just take a moment to reflect.
Touched upon really good topics, and thank you for sharing. Um, yeah, I think thank you for having a conversation about education, intersectionality, immigration, and I think that it's important. I agree to it's important to continue to have conversation. You again, Petrona, that however someone can, even if you just want to educate yourself by reading a book, that's like go for it. Yeah, I hope you have a great rest of your day.
That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you
Nos
all for
vemos.
listening.